what I define mental toughness is, it comes closer to the Jim Laird definition was, hey, getting the most out of what you have to be at your best when it matters the most. It's very simple. I'm going to say it again. Mental toughness is getting the most out of what you have to be at your best when it matters most. And ultimately, it's a combination of two things. It's resilience and performance. It's playing your ability to play psychological defense, which is to bounce back after adversity. And it's also to be able to then execute tasks and do your job, which is about optimal performance.
Hello, my friend. Welcome to Something for Everybody. My name is Aaron Machbitz. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah, I'm pumped. I love your content. I love what you put out into the world, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. So thank you for being here. And before we sort of get into the meat and bones of this conversation, I have a very important question to ask you, and that is, how are you doing? Really, how are you doing?
It's a great question, because how many times do we ask people how they're doing and we never stop to listen what their response is and lean in too. So I guess maybe let's frame it in a way, hey, am I surviving? Am I coping, or I'm thriving? I'm somewhere between probably like upper range of coping right now and thriving. So thanks for asking.
What are you trying to cope with specifically?
Yeah, I'm going through, for me, transition from the military has been very difficult. And obviously I'm dealing with entrepreneurship. I've changed jobs multiple times over the last couple of years. And so it's been a creative, experimental journey to figure out not only what I'm good at, but what I want to do and how to bring good into the world. It's that ikigai concept. So refining my ikigai about, hey, what am I passionate about? What am I good at? What I can make money at? And then really refining that has been a process. And it's, the Veterans Administration says that about 80% of veterans who leave the military, and this is a higher percentage for those who spent a career in the military like I did, they tend to change jobs at least twice in 2 years. That makes me feel a little bit better, because I've definitely have met that number and then some. But, just want to take care of my family, but I also want to, continue to be able to serve my community, our state of Texas, and the country. And my mission is just to help as many leaders and teams and performers as I can to forge the mental strength to win from the inside out consistently and become the best version of themselves. And sometimes, entrepreneurship is the hardest thing I've ever done. Transition has been a lot harder than I could imagine. And so that experimentation process, it takes a lot of attention and energy. And so I'm not quite where I want to be yet. I'm not satisfied. So I'm just going to keep, like Sisyphus, the Greek myth, I'm going to keep pushing that rock up the hill. And once in a while, I'm going to stop and take the opportunity to reflect on the journey and smile. Because if you can imagine Sisyphus smiling, that would be a really cool thing, right?
Right. Well, for those that aren't in the military and don't know that life, what's so complicated and hard about leaving that community and joining the civilian world?
Yeah, and I think this is really important related to this idea of mental fitness, right? When we think about mental health, obviously that's the pathology, prevention of pathology. We think about the coping side I just mentioned, which is like counseling, and that's the prevention of sliding into psychopathology. And then we think about the performance band of psychology as well too. And I think veterans, just like anybody, goes through that whole. We operate along that psychological spectrum throughout the course of our lives. For me, there's a couple of reasons I think why it's complicated. I think that athletes go through a very similar thing, or anybody, who's, it's not just a job, it's a career, but more than a career, it's a lifestyle. So in other words, if your job or your career impacts your life in a way to where it starts to consume your identity and your purpose. So in other words, your values, your beliefs, your purpose become part of the core of who you are. The more that gets wrapped around itself, the difficult it is to be able to then, what I call like molting, to where you get to shed that skin, and still reveal the true identity of who you are, but realize that I am not my job. I am not my career. So for me, I mean, you think about it, I came into the Army at 17 years old when I went to West Point to get recruited to play football. I spent my entire 20 years at war, leading men and women into combat. And so that was never the plan. It just was a really good fit for me for a lot of different reasons. It felt like sports. And as you know, Aaron, I mean, you were a team sport guy. You're still a team sport guy. To me, being in the Army was the ultimate team sport. And I woke up every day. I was around amazing people. I had amazing bosses. Not everybody in the Army, is a high performer. I mean, they are in the special forces community by and large, but it's a cross section of America. But I will tell you, like, the quality of the people that I was around was really been second to none, especially the further I get away from the military and I'm in the civilian world. That's not to say that people in the civilian world are dirtbags. It's just the disparity of the common purpose and mission, being a part of something bigger than yourself, is a little bit different. So when you leave that, and then it's a part of your identity, it becomes difficult, right? Because you're trying to not only figure out where you're going to go and what you're going to do, but also you're figuring out, who am I? And I think a lot of veterans, and I think I see this athletes as well too, as I mentioned, probably law enforcement would probably be a third one that's like this, is that when they don't ask the question, who am I, it makes it, very difficult, to make that transition, right? And I think what works sometimes in the military, like I know from my leadership style, worked for in the military, and what worked, in terms of being very aggressive, I call full contact leadership, that doesn't translate very well in the civilian world. And especially doesn't translate now when I think we're working in a remote environment, people a little bit more sensitive. And so you have to make a lot of adjustments in terms of what your expectations are and how you fit in and how you can continue to serve and give back. So I think that's why that's where the struggle comes in from people who've been in uniform specifically.
Yeah, I think about this identity piece a lot, and I came across a pretty good definition which helped me a bit. Was like, identity is repeated beingness. That makes
Hmm.
sense to me. Okay, so who am I
Yeah.
being? More so, what values do I show up as? That's really who I am.
Right.
But as you're saying, like, for a long time I played baseball, and I absolutely loved being identified as a baseball player. Like, people
Right.
talked about me like, "Oh, that's Aaron, he's a
Right.
baseball player." I fucking love that, man.
Yeah.
But it also foreclosed me into being a specific thing. Like, I wasn't
Right.
anything else. And
Yes.
then when that career ended, I transitioned into being a wrestler, and
Right.
oh, that's the pro wrestler. He runs around in his underwear. Great. That's a fantastic, that's Jackson Stone. Right.
Yeah.
And then when both of those things come to an end, it's
Yeah.
I don't know. The only time I think it
Yeah.
becomes a real issue is like when you're saying, is when you're transitioning out into something and you have that sort of that time to actually sit down and reflect, like, okay, like now, like, I'm not a baseball player anymore. I may
Yep.
not play baseball at a high level. I don't
Right.
wrestle anymore. I'm not
Right.
in the military. Do
Right.
I actually have any value as a human being? That's where the thoughts go. Like, am I
Sure.
enough? Am I worthy to do anything?
Right.
And for me, at least, that's where the sort of the struggle of
Yep.
mental health came in.
Yeah.
I had a situation in my life that sort of forced me to figure it out, or I wasn't going to make it to the next day.
Right.
And with athletes and with those in the military, or those anything that sort of
Yeah.
have to become obsessed at something to reach an
Yeah.
elite level, as you obviously know, because that's the people you work with on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
There's a way to do it, I feel like, in a
Yeah.
healthy manner, where you can have this obsession but also not foreclose your identity on this thing. You can be expansive
Yep.
but also be sort of narrow-minded in the mission, I
Yep.
believe.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Aaron, too, because it's something I'm really interested in right now too, in working with, veterans and athletes who are going through a transition, and some nonprofits participated in some studies that, look at the research and the connection between those two, because veterans have a ton of resources, athletes don't. And a lot of people are thinking, oh, well, athletes, they're millionaires, and well, guess what? Not all athletes are millionaires. I mean, I like that dichotomy of what you're talking about is really interesting in baseball players specifically. I saw that too. A little bit different than football players who are in the NFL, because they make there's no minor league system for the NFL. Well, I guess the XFL and USFL is kind of becoming a minor league system, so that's
Yeah.
going to be interesting. But let's talk about minor league baseball, since you were a baseball player. You can appreciate that. You're laser focused on making it to the league, right? You want to live your big league dreams, and I saw that play out. And sometimes if you're coming in and you're undrafted, you're a free agent, maybe you're coming from a Latin American country where you got your whole family that's relying on you to make it to the big leagues. It puts a lot of pressure on them, and so they're just focused on making it to the big leagues, but the odds are firmly stacked against them. 10% of players make it to the big league. Like, it's actually less than that. And so, and then less than 1% of all players who make it have, stay long enough, they have a cup of coffee, as they say, and then they end up coming back down to the minor league system. They spend the majority of their time there. Well, it takes such a long time to move through that farm system and that pipeline, is that, I find a lot of athletes, hey, they're 25, 30 years old. There's a great story about a player who's like 32 years old, which, is over the hill for professional athletes. Finally got it, finally got a taste of the big leagues, got called up, right? Well, what happens if, what's grit's glass ceiling is what I call it, right? So if grit, according to Angela Duckworth, is the passion and perseverance over time, and you're laser focused on accomplishing your goal, at what point in time do you need to cut your losses and develop, an alternate plan, right? And so for me professionally, I always, to fall back on a military term, I always want to have a pace plan, so I can always take care of my family. I have a primary means, I have an alternate, I have a contingency, and I have an emergency, right? You don't have to always have a pace plan professionally. But what I taught baseball players was, hey, look, if you're in AA and you're 3-4 years in, what's your backup plan? What's your alternate plan, right? So, and part of that discussion was looking at I know we're going to talk about the 4C model, was really building their character and their identity, which really, going back to, again, starts with, hey, your values. What are the principles that really matter to you, right? What are the 3 to 5 things? And that becomes really the framework for how you see yourself and how you see others, which is your belief system. Because then that belief system really gets into the perception and perspective. Perception is the lens in which I see myself and others in situations. Perspective is the understanding and interpretation about what happens to me, and as I take action and agency and control over my destiny, right? And then the last piece then is my purpose. That's my mission, right? So what is my mission in absence of baseball, right? And I think when you start to really develop that character, it becomes the foundation, the core of who you are. And that, it doesn't make it easier, but it increases the probability that transition is going to move towards something to where you can continue to be able to learn and grow, regardless of whether or not you find you're the right fit, within or outside of baseball. But it just opens up your aperture to possibilities, right? Because I think it's a little bit dangerous to be myopic and to have blinders on in any profession, because the reality is, I think, we're all expendable, right? In certain cases, but again, another thing that's difficult. People are our most important resource in everything that we do, organizationally on a team, right? But that's at the same time, hey, we can leave and somebody's going to replace us, right? Whether we get fired, whether we get injured, whether, we quit, right? It's always a next person up. And so that's another interesting thing as well, too, is that how do I continue to invest in my people, but knowing that it's always going to be the next person up, right? So you are not the end all be all, right? And, it sounds selfish and self-centered, but you have to lead yourself first. You got to take care of yourself first, but at the same time, be focused on, the people to your left and right and the mission, but those sometimes can be at odds with each other, right?
Yeah, it can. And I feel like back to like maybe a couple minutes earlier when you're talking about transitioning, right? It's like, I think also athletes have a tough time extracting the skills that they've learned as an athlete into a different domain. Like
Right.
I had a hard time figuring out what baseball taught me after I was done playing baseball, because I was so bitter and resentful that baseball ended. I had no idea that it taught me resiliency and grit and
That's right.
teamwork and
Yeah.
compassion and like, oh,
Yeah.
all of these things that I need to do this podcast. Like I didn't get good at baseball. It took me 15 years. Okay, so why am I expecting my podcast or me to be good at podcasting in 1 year? I should
That's right.
expect that in 10 years or
Yeah.
15. And I look at guys like Rich Roll, who are one of the best podcasters in the world. He's doing it 10 years and he's
Yeah.
like, I can still get better. And so I think
Yeah.
athletes have a
Right.
hard
Right.
time with that, extracting those skills. But then if they speak to someone about it, they're like, dude, no, you have these skills. Now you
Yeah.
just have to like have a little bit of time to figure out where you might want to implement those skills next. Are you into business, into
Right.
sales, into real estate,
Yeah.
into coaching potentially? And
Yeah.
then use those same exact skills, and now
Right.
you're able to be this full human being who's not just this one thing, but
Yeah.
use all of the skills you learned from this amazing thing that you had, which is being
Yeah.
able to play sports at a high level or
Right.
any time playing sports is
Mhm.
amazing. And
Yeah.
then like, oh, now I can do it with coaching or being a dad or being a kindergarten teacher or whatever the case is, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's also important, just to be able to
Yeah.
sit and reflect on that.
Mhm. That's a great point, Aaron, because, and that's why I'm so passionate about these so-called soft skills. And I don't call them soft skills, I call them soft skills, because special operations forces use them. And I always tell them, hey, there's nothing soft about some of the baddest ass people on the planet, that I got a chance to serve and be able to work with, right? There's just skills. And so we tend to focus on hard skills because what gets measured gets managed. So think about like your craft, or even on the physical side, we can, we understand that from maybe nutrition and a recovery and an exercise standpoint. But those intangible attributes that make us who we are, whether or not we're members of a team, we're teammates or leaders, right? There's a way that those are skills, those are learned behaviors that we can actually develop. And I think that's really important for the performance of transition. That psychology of transition is often overlooked and forgotten, right? Because like I said, like there's very few things that you're going to learn in sport, maybe even in the military. Like I was a field artillery officer. I blew stuff up for a living. My job is to be able to, call in airplanes and artillery and mortars, and to put warheads on foreheads and jump out of airplanes. That does not necessarily translate to the civilian world. But the things that I learned, in terms of, the mental skills, the emotional skills, the social skills, those soft skills or soft skills are really what carry the day. And they don't, and I think when that starts to turn on the light bulbs for a lot of athletes, right? Because when you learn how to be confident despite setbacks, when you learn how to concentrate and miss distractions, you learn how to be composed under extreme circumstances, you learn about motivation and discipline towards accomplishing your goals, you learn how to look at challenges and opportunities to be able to learn and grow. Like all those things that you can bring to bear, they translate from the ball field to the boardroom and to the battlefield, but also into life.
Yeah. There's something you said at the very beginning that caught my attention. That said, being an entrepreneur is the hardest thing you've ever done, and that's surprising considering you went to West Point, you've been to the military, you went to war, you're a dad, right? That's also a really hard thing. Why entrepreneurial ship is the hardest thing you've ever done?
Well, one, it's, by nature, it's just difficult. I mean, the majority, it's like baseball, right? Baseball is a game that's built on failure, and it takes a lot of resilience and grit and persistence to be able to break through. And so I think entrepreneurship is in business is a venture that's built on failures. Well, to the majority of businesses that start and fail, you hit on something that I think really was a light bulb moment for me, Aaron, just now too, is that it has to do with your expectations about what you can do and not do, and how long it takes to be good or be competent, let alone be very good, great, and elite, right? You're just talking about the Rich Roll example, but you talk about from our athletic perspectives about how long it took us. I mean, the whole Andres Erickson thing was taken way out of context, right? That in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliers, right? It's not everything takes 10,000 hours or 10 years, right? But it definitely takes a lot of practice to become consciously competent, let alone unconsciously competent at any set of skills. And I think for me, although you know, I think a lot of things that from the military set me up well to be an entrepreneur. One of them is my grit, my determination too. But there's so many things that go into building a business, right? In terms of all the fundamentals, right? And it's like for me, it's like okay, I'm a really good speaker, right? I've honed that craft, right? I'm not great yet by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a pretty good coach, definitely not great. I'm really good at facilitating, doing workshops. I'm starting to learn about with my business partner how to develop really great educational content. But how do I package that together into a business and then market it, for example, and sell it and get it out in the world? Because you could be the greatest things in sliced bread, but if you don't have the vehicle to be able to get it out in the world, then one, you're not going to add value. B, you're not going to make money, right? And so that's kind of where I'm at. I've only been a year doing this, and another thing too. Uncle Sam just took a giant bite out of my behind, which is another kind of punch to the gut. You're not making a lot of money. I'm lucky. I'm retired. I can take care of my family just by waking up in the morning because of my 20 years of service, right? But I think the reality is that my expectations don't match the reality of what it takes to be successful in this venture, right? Because I think we also don't have patience. We have what's called a drive-through mindset as Americans. Like we believe in hard work. We're not willing. We don't have the staying power especially when things get tough. To be able to see things through, right? And so we want that instant gratification. And I think coming from a high performance arena, whether it's in the military or in sports, our expectations, like, are really interesting. And an expectation is, a belief that something's going to happen based on your relative experience or credible information. And so you can have all the credible information in the world, but if you don't have the relative experience, you don't have an expectation, you have an anticipation. And if you
Mm,
have, if you have a lower number on those two variables, it becomes an assumption or hope. Now, hope in itself is a great thing, right? It's a very powerful emotional thing that can inspire us, but it doesn't. When things get hard, we get punched in the face. Hope isn't a method; it isn't a strategy, right? And sometimes we have to make decisions off of assumptions based on very little information. But again, we don't want to do that all the time. So I'm trying to move from hope and assumptions that I could be a successful entrepreneur, and really make my ikigai work. And but I try to move it more to anticipations and expectations. And I think you're right. My expectations about what it takes and how long it takes to become an entrepreneur has fundamentally shifted, especially in this year. And if you start to look at the entire mountain when you're at the bottom of the mountain, it can be really daunting, right? So what I've done is I shifted my expectations, my perception to like, hey, I'm just going to get it to this next ridge line. And when I get to that next ridge line, I'm going to take a knee, break out the map again, get, refuel, recover. I'm going to move it to the next ridge line, right? That's how doing high and hard things works. The science of goal pursuit really supports that idea, is that I need to segment up this idea of climbing this mountain of entrepreneurship by really influencing my expectations and the expectations of others that I work with.
yeah. I I think I think about another thing that creates a challenge internally with us is that social media, right? Because you see, at least for me, right? I see someone on social media who posts one podcast or one video and they've blown up and the whole thing is viral and they have millions
Yeah,
of followers.
yeah,
And then for like a second, it makes me a little like, upset. I feel some sort of emotion about it.
right.
And then I think to myself, okay, if my very first podcast that I put out 3-4 years ago went viral, would I have had sustaining power? I'd be like, no, that shit was terrible. I couldn't ask questions. I stumbled over my words. I didn't even have a
Yeah,
camera or a microphone. It was just my buddy holding the thing.
yeah,
So why would I, and I would have gotten all this attention and then it would have crumbled away. And so
yeah,
I think there's a social media aspect to it, but there's also a right timing in place. Like I'll never be ready per se for, let's say, if my podcast gets 1 million downloads a month, like some of the
right,
great ones,
right.
but I can be as best prepared to know that I'm firm in my stance. I have some stuff figured out. I can always improve, but
Yeah,
um, if I've built up that credibility and that consistency in myself, then I know when more people start to listen or follow or engage or buy, or I have to coach or bigger speaking engagements or whatever it is. You're and I both our cases. Then I
yeah,
know I'm actually grounded in that position. I
yeah,
actually can let go of some of the imposter syndrome a little bit and know, okay, yes, I've worked really hard to be here. Of course,
yeah.
there's another level, there's another step, but
Right.
now like this attention, I'm worthy of this attention. I think that's also another thing when it comes to being an entrepreneur. At least I've felt that over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think what you're highlighting there, Aaron, is what I call neutral thinking, and this comes from the late great Trevor Moed. Have you ever heard of neutral thinking? You read
Yes.
Gritty and Neutral? Yeah, I mean, think of it like a stoplight, and I think you have on the green light. If we're driving, that's green lights go. That's positive thinking, right? That helps to give us energy, optimism, and enthusiasm. Helps gives us that optimism that we're looking for. But the negative thinking we know is undefeated, right? That's the red light thinking that causes us to stop, grinds to a halt. But we have built-in negative thinking because it was designed to be able to protect us. It's part of our risk orientation. It's like a built-in governor that we have to keep us, or those lane assists that keep us from swerving to the left and the right on a modern day car, right? But then there's this idea of neutral thinking, which often isn't talked about. And I think that Trevor Moa was onto something, and it's really reinforced by Dr. Stephen Hayes from University of Nevada, who's the founder and did a lot of research on acceptance and commitment training, or acceptance and commitment therapy ACT. So this idea of neutral thinking is this idea, okay, so when I see, let's use the social media effect as an entrepreneur or a podcaster, right? Because I do the same thing. I'm on LinkedIn, and I didn't used to be on social media. I went from being passive to active and started getting stuff out in the world and experimenting. And now I'm at the point where I'm almost trying to post every single day, right? And part of the reason why I did that, I was like, hey man, I'm trying to keep up. or, and so I'm looking at other people who are like on, let's say, LinkedIn, they're LinkedIn top voices, like my buddy John McCaskill. And I could easily look at my buddy John McCaskill and be like, man, this guy is killing it. And he's got it all figured out. But I talked to John and he'll openly admit, man, that guy, he doesn't have it all figured out either. You look at guys like, that you're talked about that started doing things like, that you look up to, like Michael Gervais, for example, too. Like, hey, Mike's been doing this for a long time, man. And he wasn't an overnight success. But when we look at them from the surface, we think that then we start to get in that comparison trap. And that comparison trap leads us into that red light thinking, that negative thinking, because that's the FOMO, or the fear of missing out, or the fear of failure, or that I'm not good enough, right? That really, creates that cortisol neurochemical drip into our system that causes that stress response, right? Now, if I can move, it's really unrealistic, for you to move from red light thinking to green light thinking right away. Because what do you have to pass through? You have to pass through neutral thinking, right? So I think when you get in those situations where I start to feel like I'm not good enough and I'm not where I need to be, I feel inadequate, I'm not doing enough, I'm not getting the results. Neutral thinking allows us to be able to shift back more onto the process, right? That allows us to be able to then pause, to look at things objectively as possible, to put things in perspective, and then be able to then, detach from maybe that negative thinking and those negative emotions that are related to that, and then shift to more, more helpful thinking, right? So a great, my to me, the ultimate neutral thought is, comes from a couple different people. Nelson Mandela is one of them. He has a great quote that I've adopted for myself. That's, I either win or I learn. I never lose. Can you imagine going through life doing what he did, where he spent, over a decade in prison? He did some things that he regretted, earlier as a young man, but learned from that experience to where he later then became the president of South Africa, where they helped end apartheid. And so you think about that from a perspective, like, I either win or I learn, I never lose, right? Maybe that's a positive statement, maybe that's more of a neutral statement, but the idea of accepting things for what they are and then detaching from that and taking that next best step is going to allow you to be able to move from, red, pass through the yellow, to where maybe I'm slowing down, or maybe I can speed up and accelerate and more getting that positive thinking, which is focusing on the attitudes and behaviors that are going to help you move your business, move your podcast, move your life in the next, in the direction that it needs to go.
Yeah, I love the idea of neutral thinking. When I was studying more of Michael Gervais stuff, he had it as very similar, like positive mind, negative mind, and no mind. No
Yeah.
mind is that you're accepting things as they come, and as you're saying, the only way to get into positive mind, which positive mind will then lead you into the flow state, is through this sort of no mind. You can't, like you say, can't go from negative to positive to, like, it's just like you have to pass through something, and then positive mind leads you into the zone, into the flow state, which is like, the magical, where the baseball looks like a beach ball, or all that good stuff. But
Yeah.
so
you
that's
know
awesome.
yeah, and I like to say, I'm I dug in a lot of the research. One of my mentors is Dr. Ken Revisa, and he used to say that the zone is overrated, and that's not to mean that it's not important, but it's so fleeting that it happens to you. It's like, we want to try to, how can we replicate as many elements of the zone or flow state that we can, right? And to me, when I teach mental toughness, people, the best, the most elite people in the world are not the ones who show up and are, all of a sudden they flip a switch and they're in the flow or in the zone, right? But it's when they have, they realize they don't always have their A game, but when they have their C game, they can get a C plus, right? To me,
Mm.
that's about optimal performance, and optimal performance is different than peak or high performance. It's more about, hey, how can I muster all the available resources I have at that given time based on what I can control in that moment? And then how do I get the most out of them to perform at the upper range of my potential consistently, regardless of what the outcomes are, right? That's what optimal performance is about, and it sometimes it flies in the face of what people know as the zone. And I tend to not even talk about it, because the reality is that it goes back to expectations. If I expect that I'm in the zone and I perform anything less than my A game, now I start that creeps in that negative thinking. My expectations don't match the reality of what it takes to be, competent.
Hmm. Yeah, I I try to tell my boys that I don't care about your best games, and I don't care about the worst games. I care about who you are in the middle, because that's the majority of your as you as a baseball player.
That's
Yes, you're
right.
going to have the game where you go 0 for 4. Yes, you're going to have with 4 strikeouts. Yes, you're going to have the game with 4 home runs or 4 doubles. Those are rare. Who are you in the middle? Like
That's right.
that's what every coach is looking at. Like, how do you show up day to day, regardless of how you feel? You have these skills or these set of protocols or these
Yeah.
practices that help you show up on the field,
Yeah.
regardless of if you went 0 for 4 or 4 for 4. And I
Right.
mean, that's exactly what you're alluding to. And baseball players with a 162 game season will
Yeah.
not show up to the baseball field every day like, oh, yeah, it's a great day. My body feels great. Everything's perfect.
Right.
I had a great conversation with my wife. My kids didn't stay up late. Travel was super easy. Like, not a fucking chance, man.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with life. Not every
Yeah.
day you're going to wake up sunshines and rainbows, but some days you're going to get great sleep. You're going to feel awesome, and that
That's
performance is
right.
going to reflect that. But how
Yeah.
do you still make it to the gym, even though you just don't really feel like it? How do you still get your work done, or pick your kids up from school, or make that lunch, or
Yeah.
do the extra rep? All of that stuff.
Yeah.
That's who you are as a person. That's what defines you. That's what people will talk about when they
Hmm.
speak about you at your funeral. Like, this guy, he showed the fuck up. He tried.
Yeah.
And I always admire that about that person, or me, or
Yeah.
myself, or that's the nugget.
That's a great point, man. And I think there's recent events, that talk about the ultimate neutral thinker who's authentic to who he is as a superstar, Nikola Jokic, right?
Mm.
I don't know if you're a basketball fan, but I tend to only watch the NBA in the playoffs, right? So and I only watch college basketball in the March Madness because that's when it gets really good. And that's when the compelling stories come out. And so, and I think it's also when they start to actually really try hard. But what an amazing story, right? I mean, this guy, you know, undrafted out of Serbia, doesn't he's a big dude, credible basketball player, master of his craft, but he's an even better human being and teammate, right? In terms of what they talk to him about, doesn't get too high, too low. I mean, I'm dying watching these. He wins the NBA championship, and I'm seeing the interviews, and he's like, "Hey, we just got the job." Most of the people, it's like the Kevin Garnett, where it's all emotional and like anything is possible, and I'm going to Disneyland and whatever. And he's like, "Yep, we got the job done. Now it's time for me to go home." Right. And then
Right.
they're like, "Hey, what did you do with the MVP trophy?" He's like, "I don't know. I gave it to the equipment guy, and I haven't seen it since." And they're like, "Hey, you can stick around for the parade." He's like, "When is it?" In the presser, and they're like, "Oh, it's coming." He's like, and he's kind of pissed. He's like, "Man, I need to get home and see my horses and my family back in Serbia. Like, y'all are kind of raining on my parade, right?" I mean, but like the guy's the same dude, whether he's the MVP of the finals of the league, whether he gets a triple double, whether they lose or whether they not, he's the same guy, right? And so to me, that's it probably starts with how he thinks, and
Hmm.
how he shows up for other people with the ultimate purpose of just winning. It's not about him. And I think if you're an athlete out there, you're a parent, you're a coach, you're a leader, take a harder look at Nikola Jokic, man, because I think he's a really great case study on an optimal performer and a neutral thinker.
Absolutely. And I'm sure this was a perfect segue, by the way, as my podcasting skills at work here. I'm sure he embodies at least one of or maybe all 4 of your 4 C's of mental toughness. So,
100%. Nice segue, man. I like that. Good bridge. Good bridge. What we want to talk about. Yeah, sure.
but yeah, I want to dive into each of these.
Yeah.
They're all extremely important. Obviously, they're sort of the bedrock of how you coach, I imagine. That's why they're your 4 C's. So let's start with one. What does mental toughness actually mean? Because I
Yeah.
think that gets thrown around a lot. And then
Yeah.
we'll start with control first.
Yeah. So I'll give you the dictionary definition of mental toughness. So and I'll tell you, and this goes back to the optimal performance thing of what it's all about. So mental toughness is the ability and willingness to be able to use a specific set of mental and emotional skills to be able to execute tasks or perform at the upper range of your potential consistently, regardless of circumstances and outcomes. That's the no kidding literature definition that comes from Dr. Jim Lair, my mentor, Dr. Jack Grapple. It comes from people who studied this, some authors like Dr. John Perry, Peter Clough, and my partners in AQR International over in England. So, and there's a lot of research that goes behind this too. What I define mental toughness is, it comes closer to the Jim Lair definition, was, hey, getting the most out of what you have to be at your best when it matters the most. It's very simple. I'm going to say it again. Mental toughness is getting the most out of what you have to be at your best when it matters most. And ultimately, it's a combination of two things. It's resilience and performance. It's playing your ability to play psychological defense, which is to bounce back after adversity. And it's also to be able to then execute tasks and do your job, which is about optimal performance. So if you can do those two things, you can play psychological offense and defense. You can be really competent. You're more likely to be, to get the most out of what you have and influence others towards common goals. I think the 4 C's is a great model. One, because it's very simple. It's easy to remember. Like as we talked about in the pre-show, that I'm really passionate about working with a lot of youth athletes, especially teenagers, coaches, and parents. So having a model that's very easy to understand and it's a low barrier of entry to be able to then wrap their head around it, that's great. And it's a visual conceptual model that they can then turn into skills, tactics, and processes they can go action right away. And so, it'll be in the show notes, but it looks like a pizza pie, the 4C model too. And you divide that pizza up into quarters, you get the 4Cs. And so it's what's interesting about the 4C model also is that it's both an inside out and an outside in process. So a lot of people who are familiar or not familiar with, mental skills training from sport and performance psychology or positive psychology, a lot of the criticism comes, it's about the individual. It's not about the collective. But what I like about this model is that it shows that, hey, developing your mental game is both an inside out and an outside in process, right? And that's why I think it's so closely related to the intangible attributes and characteristics of great leaders, which is obviously something I'm passionate about as well. So that's kind of the big picture of the 4Cs. And then, where do you want to jump in and, from there, you want to start breaking it down one at a time?
Yeah, I'd love to start breaking it down one at a time. I think starting with control
Yeah.
is a really big one.
Yeah, for sure. Control is probably the most robust of the 4Cs because there's just a lot of tools that are in it. And as you're looking at the model, what you think, again, going back to the pizza metaphor, right? You think about, hey, you got the core elements, the 4Cs, and then you got the ingredients that go in it, you can't necessarily see. The ingredients are like the skills and the process and the tactics that go into it. So I'm gonna break that down. So control is really broken up into two key sub factors. One is life control. Two is an emotional control. So life control is all about this idea. Hey, do I believe that I am the captain of my fate, and do I believe I control what happens to me will lead to positive outcomes and my goals over time, right? And this idea of agency, and it's really the spectrum of what's called external versus internal locus of control, which you're aware of, Aaron. So people who have a high external locus of control believe that other things like fate, luck, circumstances, others, the factors outside of ourselves probably more determine what happens to us than internal factors. So on the other end of that spectrum is that people who have a high internal locus of control tend to believe that their willpower, that their attitudes and behaviors can really influence what happens to them and also influences others. What we ideally want to have is somebody to be able to be in the middle depending on what the situation. So you don't want to be really, when it comes to life control, you don't want to be really high on external locus of control. You don't want to be really low or really high on internal locus of control. You want to be somewhere in the middle depending on the circumstances, right? And we really learned that, and this idea of controlling the controllables really came to the forefront, during the pandemic. And a lot of this has to do with philosophy. Mental toughness comes from the Stoic philosophy, and so they're really the original gangsters of mental toughness. So this stuff is 2,000 years old. Then emotional control gets really interesting too, because there's a lot that goes into that as well. And so it's the difference between experiencing emotions and being emotional. As human beings, we experience a lot of emotions, and that's a good thing. We're emotional creatures. But when our emotions start to control our attitudes and our behaviors, you probably are familiar with this idea of amygdala hijacking. Our amygdala is the part of the brain that controls a lot. That's our emotional center of our brain. When that controls our more logical prefrontal cortex or hijacks it, bad things tend to happen, right? We're more irrational, illogical. We tend to say and do things that we don't normally do that are productive and effective, right? So understanding your emotions and naming it to taming them, and understanding how they relate in this cycle of the mind-body connection between how you think, how you feel, what you do, and how that affects how you perform is really, really important. So that's emotional control. But then another piece of control too is controlling your attention. So that's, being able to take my sensory awareness, and treating it like a weapon system, think like a bow and arrow, to where, to my brain, or is the bow and the arrow is my attention, to where, my attention, my sensory awareness, goes to a target that's inside or outside of myself. Then I can shift it on demand. And then when I get an ability to get distracted, I put it back on target. It's this idea about having present moment focus. So you hear a lot about mindfulness, but mindfulness is really about present moment focus, because human beings are designed, the way that our brains and bodies are designed is to be in the here and the now, right? Although we can reflect on the past and project into the future through planning, we're designed to perform in the moment. So that's where attention control. It also debunks the idea of multitasking and the idea about monotasking, and then being able to shift on demand. And then the two other pieces that I won't belabor this too much, is about energy management. So there's mental, emotional, social, physical, spiritual elements of energy, which is your capacity to do work. I'm not talking about chakras or auras or California hot tub stuff. I'm talking about, the physics, and your biology, right? And the neurochemical aspect of energy. And you only have so much of it, like your battery, so when you're, so you think about your cell phone battery, we're always locked into where our battery percentage is, but we oftentimes don't understand where our energy levels are, and how to recharge. So it's about balancing work and recovering, understanding our relationship with stress, how to be able to manage that as well too, especially under, pressure situations. And then finally, imagery control, which is, a lot of people are familiar with this idea of visualization, but imagery is this idea is that how do we simulate something to where it's so real and vivid in our minds that it almost becomes real, to where we can change the structure of our brain, towards gaining competence, reflecting on a performance, or being able to then, see a future that we want to happen, and we're doing something in our mind to get good mental reps to be able to make that happen. So that's control is very robust, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into that, but that's your overview of control on the 4C model.
Yeah, the one that sticks out to me the most, or that's most relevant to me at this moment, is the sense of emotional control.
Yeah.
Because as the coach of a 14-year-old team, they're still not sure what to do with some of these emotions, because, as you know, on the baseball field, frustration is a very common occurrence.
Yes.
Frustration based on not getting a hit, making an error, walking a guy, the umpire, that's a large sense of frustration. So how do we feel those emotions? Because I don't want you to suppress them, right? But how do you then channel them in the right direction without throwing your helmet, screaming at the umpire, throwing your
Yeah.
hands up in the air,
Yeah.
allowing it to affect you, and then your reaction bleeds into the rest of your team. Now they're like, oh, is Jim, like, is he all right? Like, I don't know if I want the ball hit to him. Should he hit any, like, so then it just turns into sort of more,
Yep.
without really anyone communicating that to one another. And so
Yep.
trying to get that emotional control and sort of how you react to certain adverse situations,
Yep.
um, having a protocol for that, I think is really important.
Yeah. Let's pull on that thread, and I like to offer up, because I'm all about actionable information, right? The one of the strategies that I teaches is called the pogo method, right? And so you think about a pogo stick, it's all about, you can, unlike, pogo stick, like, hey, once you bounce on it and it compresses, it gets higher and higher, right? So it's a little bit different than, it's a resilience strategy and grit strategy that allows you to not just bounce back to stasis, but to be able to then hit that accelerator button, like we were talking about earlier, using the stoplight method. So pogo stands for pause, observe, getting to neutral, and onward, right?
Hmm.
So, and this, sometimes when you're in the moment, you don't always have time to be able to do that, but you can actually, like, using the baseball example. So let's say you make an error, or you strike out, or just something bad happens, right? You blow a big lead, right? Someone hits a home run off you, whatever. What's great about baseball is that there's these moments of space between plays, right? You have upwards to 15 seconds between pitches, as a great example, right? Too. So in that space, what are you doing to be able to flush what happened or filter out what happened to you, to be able to get in the moment and to be able to take the next best step? So pogo is a way of being able to do that. So the first thing we want to do, let's say when something bad happens to us, right? It's either in our control or outside of our control. hey, let's say I make an error, I'm in the field or I'm play second base. That was my position, right? So if I just made an error in second base and the first thing I do is I get pissed. My body language is, and I'm mad, right? And that's okay. That's okay. It's natural to do that. You want to process that. But as soon as you start to feel that physiology and feel that body language, those indicators that I'm going to red light thinking, I want to pause, right? And just pausing for a second and then breathing, allowing you to breathe in now allows you to be able to then create space and then regain control of my emotions before my emotions control me. So then the next thing I want to do is then I want to observe, right? And I want to really dial in to not only observing the situation and what's required of me, and then I also want to observe what's going on inside of me, and that takes like a millisecond to be able to do that. Maybe a quick body scan where I imagine kind of this MRI machine or this beam of light going down from my head, down to my feet, and then back up. And I'm doing my breathing. Okay. But I'm still in position. I'm ready for the next pitch, right? I'm ready to go. Then I want to get to neutral, right? Okay. Now what am I saying to myself? Now I'm moving to yellow light thinking in terms of what do I say to myself in a moment to shift to more neutral, right? And maybe be here or maybe more positive. Okay, that just happened. Okay, that just happened. No problem. One time, one thing. Okay, next pitch. Those are neutral statements that we can say to ourselves to now shift our thinking to now I can getting to neutral, the G. Now I can move onward to the next best step towards a small victory, which now, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for the next play. I'm here in the present moment. I'm not in the past. I'm not in the future. I'm here. And I'm now in a better position to be able to make the next play, right? And so Pogo is a very simple way that can, especially when you make mistakes and when you start to lose control, you can't flip a switch in the middle of the game and expect Pogo to work. That's why you got to implement Pogo and what's great about the mental game is you can incorporate that in your daily life. You can incorporate that at home. You can incorporate that in practice. And the more reps you get at that, the more competent you can become at it. So eventually you're consciously competent, meaning that I'm aware of this process and I can activate it. But eventually over time, what's great is that you can become unconsciously competent at it to where now it's just a part of who I am because I've done it so much. Now it's a part of a natural part of my response system where I don't have to think about it. It's just my natural way of responding to the situations, right? It's easier said than done. That's why it takes deliberate and intentional practice. So Pogo is a practical way you can put for your listeners to be able to put some resilience into action.
Fantastic. Love that insight. Next one, commitment.
Yeah, commitment. So commitment is really all about stick-to-itness. Okay. And so there's two sub-factors for this. One is about achieving results, which is, about, getting stuff done. That's about winning. I mean, let's face it, winning matters, right? And life's not fair. Not everybody gets a trophy, but ultimately, the process and the results matter. So whereas goal orientation is more about the process, which is about, hey, how do I develop a roadmap for my success? Understand where I'm at now based on where I've been. What are the waypoints or next steps to be able to take steps towards my goal? How do I get back on track? So that's really about the art and science of goal pursuit. And then, getting stuff done then is about this idea of commitment and discipline. Motivation and discipline. This is where I really talk into this idea about, for your listeners that are out there, there are people, James Clear and Jocko, who seem to think that discipline and motivation are sometimes they're not related or it's one versus the other. That couldn't be any further from the truth because the science actually shows that it's they work better together to be successful, to achieve results and accomplish your goals and to grow. It actually requires commitment, which is about it requires motivation, especially the internal motivation, which requires, think about self-determination theory, which is about competence. Am I good at it? Autonomy. Do I have the resources to do it on my own with the team? And then relatedness. Is it related to, other people in this situation? So that internal motivation that becomes the fuel that drives my engine. And so when I have that, that's really important, right? But then at the end of the day, I'm not always going to feel, going back to the emotional control piece, I'm not always going to feel good. I'm not always going to be my best. I don't feel like working out, right? I didn't sleep very well. I'm tired at the end of the day. Hey, it's a lot easier to eat those chips and eat that ho-ho and, have that go through the drive-through or whatever it is too. It's easier to to cancel me going out to have lunch for my friend because I don't feel like going out, right? And being social for whatever reason too. But that's where discipline comes in because discipline is about compliance. And a lot of people relate to me being a soldier and, being a military man is that, hey, that we're all inherently disciplined, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Because to me, I was always focused on influencing my soldiers by inspiring them through commitment first, right, which starts with their why, and understanding what their each individual motivational factor is. But then we had the compliance factor that was built in. But just because I, as an officer, first said, when I told somebody to do something, it's technically a lawful order, right? Because I didn't walk around barking orders on every single day. That would make me a terrible leader, because that made me focus more on compliance. Now, is that important in the battlefield when we don't need to sit here and talk about the why and the what and the how and all this stuff? Yes, it is, and that's why the structure is what it is. 248 years old, right? Even older than that, about compliance, that model, right? But modern humans, we are more commitment focused, but that nice combination of commitment and compliance is the secret sauce to help us then develop it too. But this is one of my favorite areas because I think goal pursuit is another thing that has a misnomer behind it. And so, like, understanding, having a process of helping people develop their roadmap for success and taking high and hard goals and then breaking them down into actionable steps and then incorporating how they think and what they do and other people. There's a lot. I think what's cool about goal pursuit is that it incorporates all the rest of the mental and emotional and social skills that to bring it to bear through one process.
Yeah, discipline. I think disciplined people just feel, those who aren't disciplined look at people who are disciplined and think, oh, they were born with that. That's an inherent trait.
Yeah.
And I can never. It's like any skill, any mental skill. You can
Yeah.
become more optimistic. You can get more calm. You can become
Yeah.
more disciplined.
Yeah.
But it does take tons and tons of effort. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to get up every single morning and work out, but I do, because it's part of who I am now. I've been doing it since I was 13 years old.
Yeah.
And, 17 years later, that's just who I am. It didn't happen the first couple years, right? But it's like, whatever, you can relate it to anything.
Yeah.
And the same as like goal setting. There's a book that says, you want to create habits that are too small to fail. And I think that's really quite important.
Yeah.
Because if you make them so sort of quote unquote embarrassingly small, then your goal for your workout plan is to do one jumping jack. That's it.
That's it.
Okay. You nailed it. You did it. And now how can you do two next week? And then not, I'm going to work out 7 days a week for 60 minutes each day. That's
Yeah.
like, you're putting yourself in a position to make yourself feel like shit
Yeah.
already. And
Right.
so that stuff is important to get. Like, you've talked about it a lot today, like getting honest. You have to get honest. Like, where am I at?
Right.
Actually, like, where am I
Right.
actually at? Not where I think I could be, or
Right.
where Jim is, who's also in the same class as me. Like, where do I sit? Like, I
Right.
cannot beat reality. Reality wins every time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's
Yeah.
also important when it comes to anything in terms of,
It's a great
performance.
point, Aaron, too. I want to pull on another myth that you see out there is this idea of 1% better. That's James Clear's Atomic Habits. And again, I love that book. I don't agree with everything James Clear says. He's an author, and hey, and so he's not a psychologist, right? So very smart guy, very well researched, right? But he missed some things, right? I don't think James Clear intended us to believe that every coach in America was going to adopt this idea of 1% better, and then that becomes our expectation that we're going to get 1% better. It's like this linear progression upwards, right? Okay, and some
Mhm.
things that we do, the idea of getting 1% better, so like this, weight loss or improving my strength, or developing a good sleep habit or nutrition habits. Those are just some examples. Maybe it's me going back to school to get my degree. Like when you think that if you think you're gonna get 1% better every day, you're really setting yourself up for failure, because progress is nonlinear, right? And there's a great graphic that I like to show when it's like, hey, about when people are developing the mental game, what can they expect? Some days, like, you may get 10% better, actually, right? Some days you may get 30% worse, right? Some days you may get 0.00001 better, and it doesn't even feel like you got better, because you're like, man, I don't know. But I think that understanding the relationship between our expectation and what progress looks like is really, really important, and making sure that perception of my future self, my aspirational self, and the reality of where I'm at, bridging that gap as much as possible, is really the key to success, right? And I think When I think when people start to get sideways is when they say, like you're talking about, like very common thing with me is like, I used to think that if I wasn't like fully drenched in sweat and I didn't feel like I completely got my ass kicked, that I didn't get a good workout in. Now as an older athlete who's, I call myself a trifathlete, sometimes there are days, sometimes there are days, I'm a Clydesdale in every way on that, but, the hippos, I call myself, but there are days where, just like last night is a great example. It's been a long day. It's my turn to cook dinner, and so, hey, 8 o'clock, head out in the garage, and so I just put on 30 for 30 to watch the third installment of Bill Walton's documentary. And it was 40, 50 minutes. I just rode on my Concept 2 rower, rode for 40 minutes. Didn't feel like doing it. But hey, got in there. And before I know it, I got a good workout in, And
Hmm.
so just by, and I talked to my son about this as well, too, because he's training for his first football season. He's going into 7th grade. I'm teaching him how to train, right? And it's not about working out, it's about training, because we're doing something for a purpose, right? We were in the gym and, we're taking the car ride over. It's just a mile away at our local gym. And he's kind of like, he hung out with his cousin all day and he didn't feel like working out. Right. And so we had to sit down and get a talk to be able to get his mind right, to be able to talk about, hey, sometimes we just need to start and let's think about how good you're going to feel when you just get this done. Right. Okay. You don't have your A game today, right? You don't feel like doing it, but we're going to do it anyways. And we're just going to stack wins. Those little micro wins are like, okay, let's get through the warm up. Now let's get through the first exercise. Let's get through the second one and the third one. Before you know it, you're not building momentum. And now when your mind was seemed to be really hard, it was actually easier because now I'm doing it. Right. And so in
Hmm.
our minds, we sometimes make things a lot harder and bigger than they actually are. So again, bridging that perception, reality, that future self, the current self is as much an art as it is a science.
Yeah, and I imagine that that blends right with the next C, which is confidence.
Yes, sir. Yeah, great. Okay, so confidence is really important, and I would argue a lot of people ask me, "Hey, what's the C that you come across the most, especially with youth athletes?" And this is it right here. I actually believe, if I was to extrapolate this, there's a confidence crisis that's going on right now in our country. It's the number one reason why people come to me, because a lot of athletes struggle with their inner belief in themselves, which is what confidence is about, and they struggle with their ability, their confidence in their abilities, that they can actually do it. It has to do with their perception of their competency, and then also beyond self has to do with interpersonal confidence, which is about building rapport and trust, and not only influencing confidence in others, but then actually having confidence be influenced by other people as well too, especially if you're on a team or your family or your tribe and community, right? Because we're social creatures. So it starts again then building off of that belief system. So if we've done a really good job at the core element, which we talked about, the center, this isn't actually part of the original model, something I built in. The character piece, which I talked about earlier, is the foundational piece, where we talked about values, beliefs, and purpose as part of your identity. And once I understand my belief system and what my beliefs are that help me and hurt me, I can now then begin to really build the foundation of my confidence, right? Because that influences the lens in which I see myself and others. So I got to understand beliefs can help us and hurt us. It's like an iceberg effect. They call positive psychology, call them iceberg beliefs. So now when I start to turn those into affirmations that are the anchor into my belief and value system, they really identify who I am, like as a competitor, as an athlete, as a person, as a father, husband, friend, whatever. That's first and foremost. Now I start to be able to then use things like to my advantage, to understanding, to use psychological momentum in my favor, how I think, how I talk to myself, using the 4 P's of self-talk, right? Is it personal? Is it powerful? Is it purposeful? Is it pervasive? Right. So if I
Mm.
can use those things to my advantage, understand what positive thinking looks like, understand what negative thinking looks like, there's neutral thinking looks like. And in any situation, I've got a toolkit of self-talk and affirmations that I could bring to bear and make those a habit. And there's other things that go in there as well too, that are more related to resilience, having to do with, for example, selective perception or the mental filter. So we talk about, amnesia, and how do I, whenever something happens to me that's good, bad, or indifferent, how do I then take what I need, get rid of what I don't, and then take the next best steps, right? That's this idea of selective perception that's really important as well too. And then the interpersonal confidence is really fascinating because they're really drawn. a couple of different sources. One of them is Dr. Paul Zak at Claremont University. He talks about the neuroscience of trust, which I call as the currency of high performing individuals and teams. And so understanding how oxytocin works, and what is trustworthiness about? How do I train myself to trust myself, which comes from Dr. Bob Rotella. And then how do I then, so my training mindset is bringing skill in, the trusting mindset is letting skill out. Well, then how do I bridge the gap of trust and build rapport with other people, that either on my family that I work with, that are, on my team, and so on and so forth. Right. And that really gets into another piece as well, too, which is communication. Communication is the vehicle in which the transaction of trust happens. Right. So we think about, trust being, this currency. How do we invest it in ourselves, and how do we loan it to other people with terms? And the way we do that is through how we communicate. So that has to do with everything, really starting with the Moravian model, which has to do with this idea that 55% of how we communicate to build trust has nothing to do with what we say. It's our body language, right? So how do we use
Mm.
things like mirror and matching? How do I use my body language, in terms of how I show up, to be able to communicate with other people? And then and then also determines how people see me. 38% has to do with the tone and tempo, with how I say things, and only 7% has to do with what I actually say. I think once people understand that and are aware of that, they can then start to develop some strategies on how to then better influence other people towards optimal outcomes. And so there's nothing called active constructive response. This is where another thing that I teach coaches, which is about motivational interviewing, which is about, hey, how do you act? How do you ask really good questions to meet an athlete where they're at, and then plant the seed to where it becomes their idea, and then where they're taking action with how they think and what they do versus you dictating it to them. So motivational interviewing is a big piece of that as well, too, that I bring into that. It's just one of the tools that we bring to bear when it comes to confidence.
What do you think of the statement? You may not always feel confident, but you can always behave confidently.
Yeah, I think, I think that's different than the whole fake it till you make it thing, right? Because I don't believe in the fake it till you make it thing, right? Because I think it's disingenuous. It's a short term strategy. It's a short term tactic that isn't going to lead to a consistent optimal results, right? But I do believe is that it kind of goes back to, again, like, do I have my A game or a C game? So when I don't feel well and I work with an athlete who is not wasn't aware of how his body language starts to telegraph what type of day he's going to have, right? And so by shifting his awareness outside of himself to other people, he's seeing how his body language is reflecting what he's thinking and how he's feeling, and
Mhm.
ultimately how he performs. So just by him understanding about, like, okay, well, his body language is like dejected and his shoulders are slumped and his eyes are down and he's kind of got that resting dick face going on that I tend to have too when I'm concentrating. It's what you're showing is that you're not building trust in others. Like, oh crap, here we go again. This is the bad Andy that's showing up today. Okay, this is what we're gonna get. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But sometimes by you, hey, okay, I don't feel great today too, but you know what? I'm gonna walk tall. I'm gonna get big, get my breathing up. I'm gonna smile, right? Just by smiling and changing your body language sometimes can help change your mood, right? So there's as much a physical and physiology, a behavioral thing that can help shift to your attitude and affect your emotions in these situations. So that I do believe in, but if it's disingenuous to you, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, as an athlete, like some days we just walk in like we have our C game, but what protocols, like you're saying, can I actively make the choice to do? Okay, I can still have big body language. I
Yeah,
can still show up and play hard, and I can run, and I can sprint, and I can have energy, like as much energy as I have in the tank. And there's
yeah,
those active choices that you can make that help you then turn your feeling of little confidence into, okay, I got a C plus, like I can get to a B maybe. Okay,
yeah,
this is awesome. I'm feeling it a little bit. Now momentum is moving,
yeah,
and like, yeah, that's it. I don't like fake it till you make it either. So
yeah.
that's good.
No, and I think that's what people want is people love, because it's interesting. We expect consistency and we want consistency, but it's like this ever moving target, right? It's so we're as humans, we're so inconsistent and unpredictable as well too. We're not robots, right? We're not artificial intelligence, right? So it's like, but when people's people can expect regardless of, hey, they're going to get the same guy like Jokic, right? So it's like, hey, when they know what they're going to get, regardless of how you feel, that's what helps build trust with people,
Mm.
and that's how you build confidence, right? Because you can sometimes surprise yourself, like you said, going back to my son the other day too. We talked about getting his mind right, and we kind of went through a mindfulness practice ahead of time, and we had a quick conversation about how he feels, and then I said, hey, well, let's check it afterwards, and let's see. Right now he's like, hey, I got a D. Well, okay, let's see what you give yourself when you're done. And he said he went from a D to a B by the time we went home, right? And so he completely surprised himself and even me by making that shift, right? But all that started, it was very incremental. It was just one thing at a time.
Yeah, that's huge. Amazing. Last one of your four C's is challenge.
Yeah, challenge. Yeah, one of my favorites, because I wrote a book, helped co-author a book called Deliberate Discomfort. So this is about the art and science of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and this is what. First of all, it has to do with risk orientation, right? And so you think about, like, you know someone who is really high risk and doesn't take into account like safety and so on and so forth. So someone who like think about someone who works in the stock market. So I look at risks of, like, in terms of like going back to the investment thing too. So, like, hey, are you going to go the high risk, high yield? You got to risk it, no biscuit mentality. These are the people who like to take chances and they throw caution to the wind, so on and so forth, right? And then you get a lot of hits and misses, right? And sometimes you need to be able to be willing to take risks and do that cost benefit analysis, right? In terms of how you go about things. Like, being an entrepreneur is really high risk,
Mm.
because of the chance of failure, right? Being a baseball player is a really high risk thing is too, because it could really screw with you. So, understanding, like, hey, when do I need to go, do the really high risk, high yield, day trade stock investment, and when do I need to do the Roth IRA, the go-to thing where it's going to steady Eddie, so on and so forth. It's not high risk. It just, so on and so forth. Again, it's along a spectrum in terms of your risk orientation. Is it first and foremost, and the second thing is your willingness to stretch yourself, right? And so
Mm.
the best way that I heard this, to use a metaphor, is think about this idea that across the human spectrum, both mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, you're intentionally, getting out of your comfort zone by doing things you wouldn't normally do. Maybe it's a part of your daily routine. Maybe it's learning something new. Maybe it's making a new friend. Maybe um, you know uh, it's having an experience that I've never had before that may be uncomfortable. And what you're actually end up doing, in every aspect of who you are, you're walking yourself to the edge of yourself. You're peering down into the abyss, to where it should make you a little nervous and a little scared, before you do it, while you're doing it. Okay. And then what you do is then you walk back and you recover. And then you walk yourself out to the edge of yourself again. And you're going to notice the edge of yourself, it will extend, right?
Mm.
Okay. But it takes you, the way that you grow is by shocking the system sometimes. It's by extending the edges of yourself and every part of who you are as a human being. If you're willing to do that by doing hard things, and everybody's version of hard is different, by the way, too, right? So, hey, someday I want to, I never done a triathlon. I did a half Ironman, you know, uh, and so that was very daunting to me. I broke it down and did it, but, like, hey, I wasn't a swimmer, I wasn't a cyclist, and I thought I was a runner. Turns out I'm a way better cyclist than any one of those things through. But by doing that, I really became much, much better at all three. Because you're combining all those disciplines together too. So really specifically on the swimming thing was a great example. I'm way outside of my comfort zone on that one too. But just by me getting in the pool and working on the small things like my stroke, learning how to relax in the pool and so on and so forth, I went from swimming 100 meters and being gassed, and I thought I was a pretty good swimmer, to, being able to swim well over a mile and like it's no sweat, But I think that by me willing to get in there and get out of my comfort zone, is what allowed me to be able to grow as a human being and actually enjoy the experience. Whereas, when I hated going to the pool at first, right? And so the only reason I really enjoyed going it because it was hot here in Texas and my kids could go swim in the pool. But eventually, it started to loosen up and become something that I enjoy. I think Mike Tyson has a great quote, is about, um, discipline, going back to the whole thing, is about when you start to fall in love with the things that maybe you initially hated. That's a great
Mm.
example of that, how I stretched myself and I fell in love with something that I did not like.
Yeah, the idea of just getting to the edge of your capacity uh, is such a powerful one, and you mentioned also getting to the edge of your capacity and working hard to get there and taking a few risks, but also very important is that you recover just as hard. And I mean, that's what
That's
you
right.
said. And I think that's such an important concept because we've been sort of indoctrinated into this culture of grind, 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 grind. And I,
Yeah.
I believe in that sort of grind. I believe in the working hard and the effort you have to put into. But now people like you who are putting an emphasis on recovering just as hard, my
Yeah.
sleep regimen, my eating regimen,
Yeah.
how do I recover my energy, my work, my love? Like all of those things need to
Yeah.
be integrated in harmony so that I can go out and try and be my best every day, whatever that looks like. That's also, can be different and sometimes,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, but that
It's
that I think is a very important point, the recovery piece that you
It
mentioned.
is, yeah, and this is where the growth mindset comes in versus the fixed mindset. Understanding again that something that's misunderstood is that it's not one versus the other. We both kind of like we have positive, negative thinking, in still it's part of our DNA. It's part of who we are as human beings. Is we sometimes have a fixed mindset when we experience things. We sometimes have a growth mindset, but again, if I can shift my thinking to more of the growth mindset to where I learn from everything, right, and to where I'm not afraid of results that may or may not be in my favor, because I know that I can filter that out and take something from that that's going to make myself and other people better. That's what the growth mindset is about. It's not this idea that am I always going to learn from everything? No. That's why as human beings we constantly make mistakes. Sometimes we make multiple mistakes before we actually finally learn. It's because we operate along that spectrum from the growth and the fixed mindset, depending on what our knowledge, skills, and experience is, right? And so I think that's really important for understanding too. That's Carol Dweck's work, the book Mindset, which has become really popular. But understanding how we operate on that spectrum is equally as important. You're never going to get rid of the
Yeah.
fixed mindset. You're going to be fixed on some things. Your right tendency to be fixed on some things, and you got to be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. Well, thank you, Andy. You're a legend. I love the connection. I appreciate everything you do and put out into the world. It's no small thing for what you've done and what you continue to do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And I just want to give a shout out to you. I love your story. I love your mission, which I think has become a ministry of sorts, right? And you're trying to bring this idea of mental health, wellness, and fitness into the world through this forum. I know podcasting. I have started a new podcast called School Sessions, which be on the lookout for. Is not easy, but you're a great host, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And if I can, can I give a can I let the audience know how to get a hold of me?
Absolutely. Yeah. And everything you say will be linked in the show notes.
Perfect. Yeah. So the best way to be able to follow me is my Kung Fu is probably strongest on LinkedIn. If you're on there as well too, if you're a millennial, you're probably not on LinkedIn because you think it's for old people. So I'm on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel, and I'm also on Instagram. But my Kung Fu is probably strongest on LinkedIn and Instagram. You can follow me there as well too. My company's called Design to Perform, and so you can follow me at Coach Riise. It's Riise. You can also follow my company, Designed to Perform, and reach out to me. And I love the engagement. I love to be able to again democratize mental skills training, because everyone deserves to be at their best when it matters the most and become the best version of themselves. So the best way to do that's with how you think from the inside out.
Fantastic. Absolutely love it. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Aaron. See you in the arena.
What's up, everybody? Thank you for tuning into that episode. And if you enjoyed it, click here for another full-length episode of the podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe. But above all else, most importantly, please take good care of yourselves and others. And I'll see you next time. Lots of love. Cheers.